Cueva de la Venta cave incident. On January 4th, 1989, 3 experienced spelunkers went to explore Cueva de la Venta in Mexico. Cynthia Van, Ray Hardcastle, and John Pint were doing a routine scouting mission. Cueva de la Venta was a massive lava tube near Tequila Volcano. The cave was famous for its 75 entrances that let in natural light. They traveled light with just one 6-volt flashlight and a weak disposable light. Since most of the cave was naturally lit, they didn't think they needed much equipment. The first part was beautiful with sunlight streaming through entrances. As they went deeper, the entrances became fewer and natural light faded. They reached a narrow section where the passage was only a foot wide at floor level. Above their heads, it opened to about 5 feet across. The cheerful sunlight was completely gone in this dark area. They squeezed into the narrow passage, moving sideways in single file. The walls pressed against their bodies in the confined space. Their flashlight began to dim as the battery died faster than expected. They were now far from the last entrance they had passed. The 6-volt flashlight flickered once, then went out completely. Complete darkness swallowed them where they couldn't see anything. John grabbed his nearly dead disposable flashlight with shaking hands. The weak beam came on, barely lighting up 3 feet ahead. That's when they saw a massive snake stretched across the narrow passage. The snake was 6 feet long, coiled up like a living roadblock. Its head was raised with tongue flicking, sensing the intruders. Cynthia accidentally stepped on it, making the snake aggressive. The snake's eyes reflected the weak light as it stared at them. A low hiss filled the narrow space as the snake opened its mouth. They could see its fangs with a striking range of at least 2 feet. In the confined passage, there was nowhere to dodge an attack. Then their last light died, and absolute darkness returned. They could hear the snake moving, repositioning itself and breathing. The creature was invisible but blocking their escape route. Nobody moved or spoke as the snake's presence filled the space. Hardcastle decided to back away slowly in complete darkness. He felt his way along the wall, moving carefully to avoid alerting the snake. When he reached daylight, he found a fallen pole about 8 feet long. Going back into the darkness was terrifying as he carried the pole. Working by feel, he positioned the pole above the snake's body. The creature sensed the threat and started thrashing, trying to escape. With the pole holding the snake down, they pressed against the wall. The snake's anger was intense with constant hissing echoing through the passage. Hardcastle lifted the pole and ran as the snake's fury followed them. They stumbled and ran through the narrow passage guided by memory. They didn't stop until they reached the main tunnel and natural light. Rio Camuy cave incident. On November 19, 2006, 13 tourists traveled to Rio Camuy in Puerto Rico for cave exploration. Winfredo Lopez Lucis was their 34-year-old guide with professional cave certification. He had guided hundreds of groups through these caves during his career. Carlos Lopez was his teammate who helped with the rope systems. The group included 3 adults and 8 children excited for their adventure. Heavy rains had fallen the day before, making the underground river much higher than usual. They walked toward the area where the underground river emerged from deep earth. The Rio Camuy had carved channels with walls reaching 40 feet high. Winfredo's teammate had warned him the river was flowing dangerously high. This was much higher than normal and potentially dangerous for the group. They reached the edge and looked down at the river moving through the channel. Near a 6-foot waterfall was a hydraulic where water spun in deadly circles. This was a spot where objects could get trapped forever, spinning until they sank. Winfredo and Carlos began setting up their rope system with anchor points. Carlos got ready to go down first to check the river conditions safely. Safety rules demanded someone inspect the area before everyone descended. Carlos clipped his gear to the rope and started rappelling down. He moved along the ledge and stayed away from the dangerous waterfall. The hydraulic churned beneath him with more aggression than usual. Winfredo studied the setup, but something bothered him about the water sound. The hydraulic looked more aggressive with debris swirling in the current. Despite warnings about changing conditions, Winfredo decided to descend too. People above began giving him clear and urgent warnings not to go down, but Winfredo was already committed and began his descent on the rope. Someone screamed desperately at him not to go down there. Winfredo's foot slipped on wet rock that was slicker than expected. His grip on the rope shifted and suddenly he was falling instead of rappelling. Though the belay system caught him, momentum carried him toward the water. He hit the river with a splash that echoed through the channel. The current grabbed him immediately with tremendous power. The tension on the belay line yanked Carlos from his safe position. The rope connecting them became a liability instead of safety equipment. Both men disappeared behind the waterfall within seconds. Above them, tourists watched in horror as their guides vanished. Children began crying and adults shouted questions with no answers. Carlos felt the hydraulics power as water pushed him down, then up repeatedly. The belay line connected him to Winfredo but anchored him to the hydraulics grip. 5 times Carlos fought his way to where Winfredo struggled against the current. The first time he grabbed Winfredo's arm, but the current tore them apart. The second time he tried tried to lift his head above water, unsuccessfully. On the third touch, Carlos grasped Winfredo's harness, but his body felt limp. The belay line had jammed above and couldn't be released quickly enough. When the line finally came free, both men washed into calmer water downstream. Carlos managed to untie himself and drag Winfredo's body onto a rock ledge. He began CPR immediately, pressing on his chest and breathing into his lungs. But the hydraulic had held them too long, and Winfredo was gone. Emergency services were called and rescue teams mobilized quickly. The 13 tourists were evacuated first through the cave system. Their adventure ended in tragedy as they emerged shaken and silent. Winfredo's body was recovered with careful precision by the rescue team. Little River Spring Cave Incident. On February 16, 2002, two experienced cave divers entered Little River Spring in Florida for a routine dive. Pete Reagan was 55 years old with over 300 logged cave dives under his belt. Frank Murphy, 43, was also an experienced cave diver and Reagan's diving partner. Little River Spring was part of Florida's underwater cave systems that snake through limestone bedrock. These weren't typical scuba diving spots, but serious cave diving territory for experts only. Reagan and Murphy were diving with a group of friends at the spring that day. The plan was straightforward: explore deeper passages and return before air supplies ran low. The group descended into the cave system and began their underwater exploration. The visibility was excellent, water temperature comfortable, and everything went according to plan. They planned to dive to the dome room, a large chamber deep within the cave system, but as they approached the area, the dive leader made a conservative decision. He called for the group to turn around before reaching the dome room. This followed the proper safety protocols by leaving plenty of air for the exit. As the group began their exit, two divers made a side trip to Harper Tunnel. This left Pete Reagan and Frank Murphy to continue toward the entrance together. Murphy took the lead position with Reagan following behind him. Murphy was swimming steadily toward the entrance, following the main passage back. The dive was going perfectly with plenty of air and good visibility. About 500 feet from the entrance, Murphy realized something was terribly wrong. He looked back to check on Reagan and discovered his partner wasn't behind him. In cave diving, losing sight of your partner is extremely dangerous. Murphy immediately turned back upstream to look for Reagan. What he found about 40 feet behind him was the stuff of nightmares. Pete Reagan was in full body convulsions, completely unconscious and unresponsive. Murphy was 500 feet inside an underwater cave with a partner having seizures. Reagan's entire body was convulsing violently while underwater. Murphy's training kicked in, and he swam to Reagan's aid immediately. He managed to get Reagan's regulator back into his mouth. But when Murphy checked Reagan's breathing, he wasn't breathing at all. Murphy began forced ventilation using Reagan's regulator to force air into his lungs. This was incredibly difficult to perform underwater in a confined cave passage. Murphy was performing artificial respiration while swimming to keep them both alive. The forced ventilation seemed to work initially as Reagan began breathing intermittently, but the breathing kept stopping, forcing Murphy to repeatedly perform the procedure. Murphy tried to tow Reagan's unconscious body back toward the cave entrance. He was performing life-saving medical procedures while navigating tight underwater passages. Murphy's own air supply was being rapidly depleted from the rescue effort. About 30 feet before the entrance, Murphy ran out of air completely. In a desperate move, Murphy switched to Reagan's air supply. Both divers were now dependent on a single air source to survive. Murphy continued towing Reagan while breathing from his partner's regulator. Somehow, Murphy managed to reach the cave entrance with Reagan still alive. As they emerged into the spring pool, other divers sprang into action. They pulled Reagan from the water and began CPR immediately. The scene was chaotic but organized with multiple people performing chest compressions. When paramedics arrived, they took over resuscitation efforts and transported Reagan. Ebenezer Cave Incident. On April 11, 1981, three friends went to explore Ebenezer Cave in Tennessee. John McReynolds was 16, Bon Funnel was 19, and Greg Rogers was 15. They only had 2 flashlights and were not experienced cave explorers. Only John had been in caves before, but he had never been to this cave. The three friends entered the cave and walked deeper underground. They climbed over rocks and squeezed through narrow spaces. They had to cross a dangerous narrow path over a deep pit. The path was slippery and muddy with few places to hold on. After exploring for 30 minutes, they decided to go back. They came back to the same dangerous path they had crossed before. This time they had to climb up instead of down. John went first with his flashlight to lead the way. After climbing 20 feet, John's foot slipped on the wet rocks. He lost his balance and fell into the darkness. His flashlight fell and spun around, sending light everywhere. John screamed as he fell 20 feet down into a pool of water. His friends watched in horror and couldn't help him. John splashed into the cold water and tried to swim. His arm was hurt from the fall and he couldn't swim well. Bon and Greg reached down trying to help but couldn't reach him. John got tired and started to sink under the water. The two friends shouted for help as loud as they could. Another group of cavers heard their calls for help. John Walker was leading the other group and rushed to help. John Walker dove into the water to search for John McReynolds. The water was dark and Walker could barely see anything. Walker found John's body underwater and pulled him to the side. John was not breathing and had passed out. The rescuers cleared water from John's mouth and gave him CPR. John coughed up water and started breathing again. He opened his eyes, but his words didn't make sense. John had a head injury and passed out again. Someone called the fire department for emergency help. cave rescue experts came to help get John out. They put a harness on John to lift him up safely. It took until midnight to get John out of the cave. John was very cold and badly hurt. They rushed him to the hospital in an ambulance. John stayed in the hospital for many days. Doctors found he had serious head injuries and cuts all over his body. John eventually got better and made a full recovery. Sullivan Cave Incident. Sullivan Cave in Indiana is a very long and dangerous cave system. On September 17, 2017, Lucas joined his university's caving club for a trip. Lucas and 11 other students went to explore Sullivan Cave together. Before entering the cave, Lucas left his jacket in the car thinking he wouldn't need it. He only brought a small backpack with 2 energy bars and 2 water bottles. At 10:30 in the morning, all 12 students entered the cave through a locked metal gate. They split into 2 groups of 6 people to explore the cave safely. For almost 3 hours, they explored the tunnels and chambers underground. Lucas was excited and amazed by the beautiful underground world. On the way back, they reached a section called the Backbreaker. The Backbreaker was a very narrow tunnel, only 18 inches high. People had to crawl on their bellies for 50 feet to get through it. Lucas watched the other students disappear into the tiny opening one by one. When his turn came, Lucas felt scared and decided to rush through quickly. Halfway through the narrow passage, Lucas's backpack got stuck on the ceiling. He couldn't move forward or backward and was completely trapped. The heavy rock pressed down on his backpack and spine. For 15 minutes, Lucas struggled to break free from the tight space. Finally, he slipped out of his backpack straps and pushed the pack ahead of him. He crawled like a snake on his belly and escaped the narrow tunnel. But when Lucas got out, he was confused and scared. In the darkness, he accidentally took the wrong path and got lost. He walked through unfamiliar tunnels that looked the same as before. After several minutes, Lucas realized he was completely lost in the cave. He decided to stay in one place and wait for his group to find him. Lucas called out for help, but no one answered his voice. After 30 minutes of waiting, he started looking for a way out. He found arrows scratched on the cave walls that pointed toward fresh air. Lucas followed these arrows through twists and turns for a long time. Finally, he saw natural light in the distance and felt very happy. But when he reached the cave entrance, nobody was there. The metal gate was locked and the parking lot was completely empty. His group had counted people but missed him and drove away. Lucas shook the gate and shouted, but no one could hear him. He was trapped inside the cave with no way to call for help. On the first day, Lucas ate his energy bars and drank his water. As night came, bats flew past him, so he moved deeper into the cave. Without his jacket, he felt very cold on the hard rocky floor. On the second day, Lucas became very thirsty and hungry. He licked moisture from the cave walls to get water. Lucas wrote goodbye letters to his family, thinking he might die. His phone battery died and he lost his last connection to the outside world. On the third day, Lucas felt very weak and could barely move. He was so hungry he thought about eating crickets from the cave floor. Just when he was losing hope, Lucas saw a light approaching. It was one of his club leaders coming back to check the cave. The leader unlocked the gate and found Lucas after 60 hours trapped inside. Lucas was dehydrated and exhausted but alive and thinking clearly. Alabama Mineshaft Cave Incident. On March 24, 1973, Private Randall Brown and Private Daniel Hazy went exploring in Alabama. The two 20-year-old soldiers found an old abandoned iron mine in the woods. The mine had been dug by workers in the 1800s and then left empty. Last weekend, they had only gone 15 meters into the tunnel to look around. This time, they brought military flashlights, rope, and safety equipment. Neither soldier knew how to explore mines safely, but they felt confident. They hiked 40 minutes through thick forest to reach the mine entrance. Cool air flowed out of the dark opening in the hillside. The soldiers checked their flashlights and walked into the darkness. At first, the tunnel looked strong with wooden beams holding up the ceiling. For the first 30 meters, everything seemed safe and well built. But as they went deeper, the wooden supports looked old and rotten. Water stains on the walls showed where flooding had damaged the tunnel. Small piles of dirt showed where parts of the ceiling had fallen before. Randall took the lead as they climbed up a narrower side tunnel. This part of the mine was built much worse than the main entrance. The wooden beams were spaced far apart and many were rotting. The walls were mostly packed dirt with very few stones for support. The ceiling became lower and they had to duck their heads. Despite all the warning signs, both soldiers kept exploring deeper. At about 90 meters from the entrance, disaster struck without warning. First, small rocks and dirt started falling like rain. Then a huge section of ceiling 3 meters long suddenly dropped down. More dirt and rocks cascaded down in a deadly avalanche. The wooden support beams snapped like matchsticks under the weight. Randall was directly under the collapse with no time to escape. The falling earth knocked him to his knees and his flashlight spun away. He raised his hands to protect his head, but it was too late. Tons of dirt and rocks buried him alive up to his chest. The weight pressed down on him, making it impossible to move or breathe. Loose earth filled his mouth and nose as he struggled. Daniel watched helplessly as his friend disappeared under the debris. The collapse was too big for one person to dig through. Daniel could hear Randall's struggles getting weaker as more dirt fell. The weight crushed Randall's chest so he couldn't breathe. The rumbling stopped and the tunnel became completely silent. Daniel stumbled back through the safe part and ran for help. He knew his friend was beyond rescue because the collapse was too massive. A rescue team arrived 2 hours later with heavy digging equipment. They worked to dig through the collapsed section, knowing Randall was dead. The team found Randall's body buried under thousands of pounds of earth. The mineshaft was permanently sealed after the recovery to prevent more accidents.